But what I think really is threatening is that I approach it as an ongoing, continuous phenomenon, that every day for Palestinians is another 1948. It's because of my experience inside Israel-Palestine and what I witnessed on both sides of the green lines.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. I'll try to be brief, as I want to use this entire program and part of the next to show you Max Blumenthal's outstanding speech at Central Connecticut State University. Blumenthal is an award-winning journalist and author who's been back and forth from Palestine, Israel since 2009. His video, Feeling the Hate in Jerusalem, got 500,000 hits on YouTube in one day before it was pulled by YouTube. He's the author of the new book, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel.
I'm kind of intimidated to be in this great hall surrounded by these old white men. I feel like the eyes are going to start moving behind the paintings, and they remind me of a time when we were the white Christian and democratic state, a country that feared the demographic threat of African Americans, especially in the Deep South. And we're here to talk about the Jewish and democratic state and its demographic fears. Maybe we can call it the Jewish and/or democratic state. And talking about this is not easy in the United States, although it's getting a lot easier as I've been discovering on my book tour. What I've been doing is mostly speaking on college campuses. The college campuses are much more, there seems to be some kind of understanding that the First Amendment still exists on some college campuses. That doesn't always extend to university presidents, though. I hear your president doesn't really care about this talk. He's like watching football, so maybe that's a good thing. Unfortunately, there are other presidents who are much more heavily engaged in this McCarthyite campaign of repression that is at the front of the pro-Israel playbook right now, as the pro-Israel lobby seeks to clamp down on the open discussion of the facts on the ground in Israel-Palestine by calling on elite and even state power to crush student groups like Students for Justice in Palestine. I was just on a tour of Florida. I was at Florida Atlantic University, where students had staged a walkout, silent walkout, a civil silent walkout of Colonel Benzi Gruber from the Israeli army, who was one of the advisors who established the rules of engagement for Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009, which left over 1,400 residents of the besieged Gaza Strip dead during 3 weeks of unremitting slaughter. And they were sentenced to tolerance training to be conducted by the Anti-Defamation League. This is not a joke. At Florida International University the next day, I met students who had found a listening device in the Muslim prayer room. And the university president, of course, claimed he knew nothing about that. At Northeastern University, just north of you guys, I was there about 2.5 weeks ago. Students staged a walkout on another active duty Israeli army officer engaged in the domination and control of occupied Palestinians, and they were sentenced to writing a civility statement. They were not civil to this person, and they had the police called on them. And we're seeing this across the country, especially since the American Studies Association came out with its symbolic resolution in support of BDS. We're seeing a kind of conflict between the grassroots, the students, and the organic opinion of the American public, the informed elements of the American public, against some elites who are very dependent on plutocratic pro-Israel money. And that really is not a good sign for the pro-Israel lobby, which has been seeking to prevent this discussion. And it's not a good sign that I've been talking about this book at every field house and hen house and outhouse across I haven't been to a whorehouse yet, but I'll go to one to talk about this issue. And I mean, I've been all over the country, and I'm getting really highly engaged diverse crowds, and something is really happening out there. I think that the conversation is opening, paradoxically, in this country as democratic space, to the extent that it ever existed, narrows inside Israeli society, and in Israel-Palestine, this borderless space that exists under a regime of ethnic separation, under a single regime that can only be described as an apartheid regime. And that's what I came here to talk about. That's what my book is about. My book begins with Operation Cast Lead. It was that attack that inspired me to write the book, I guess out of indignation, but also out of curiosity about the changes that were occurring in Israeli society, because there were national elections being conducted with Operation Cast Lead as the backdrop. So you saw, and this is where my book opens, on Parash Hill, just above the Gaza Strip, what journalists nicknamed the Hill of Shame, Israelis picnicking as Americans did during the Battle of Manassas in the Civil War, to watch their troops and their drones batter and reduce the Gaza Strip to rubble. I mean, 80% of arable land was destroyed in the Gaza Strip. Its only flour mill was destroyed. Its only chicken farm was destroyed. Tank units were actually ordered to destroy the Sawari chicken farms. Over 400 children, women and children were killed, most children killed at home, according to Amnesty International. And while this was occurring, people were cheering from this hilltop. One Israeli woman declared to a Danish photographer, they should wipe the whole thing off the map. Yeah, I'm a little bit fascist. And these opinions were prevalent in the mainstream of Israeli society at a time when 95% of the Israeli public, including the left-wing Meretz party, supported the attack. When Tzipi Livni, who is now the current peace negotiator for the Israeli government, declared, as foreign minister at that time, our troops behaved like hooligans in the Gaza Strip, which I demanded of them. This was her appeal to the Israeli public as she was running for prime minister. But of course, who won? Netanyahu won. He was elected prime minister. Right-wing, revisionist Zionist, hardcore Likudnik, who in 1989 said that one of his big regrets was that the government of Yitzhak Shamir failed to carry out mass expulsions in occupied territory when the world was focused on Tiananmen Square. And Netanyahu wound up occupying the hollow center of Israeli politics. Someone who had always been seen as an extreme right-winger was now in the center, with people further to his right embodying the future. Not just people in his own party, in the Likud party, like Tzipi Hotovely, the Sarah Palin of Israel, who actually speaks better English than Sarah Palin, who is younger than me and is already the deputy transportation minister and favors the annexation of the entire of 60% of the West Bank, and has hosted members of Israel's burgeoning anti-miscegenation movement to testify in the Knesset on the dangers of Jewish-Arab dating. I'm going to talk about this later. But there were people like Avigdor Lieberman and his Yisrael Beitenu party who emerged as the leaders of Israeli politics. Lieberman is now Israel's top diplomat, one of the most popular figures. He's the foreign minister. His Yisrael Beitenu party has gathered 2 seats in each successive national election since it was formed in 1999. And Lieberman's campaign in 2009 was very simple. He didn't have to do a whole lot of branding. All he needed to do was declare simply, no loyalty, no citizenship. This was directed at the 20% of the Israeli public who are non-Jewish, who are Palestinian citizens of Israel. And he called them a fifth column, a traitorous fifth column that would destroy the Jewish state unless they were stripped of their citizenship. And their only option for remaining and maintaining their citizenship would be to convert to Zionism, to declare loyalty to the Jewish state. And so as Lieberman and his party came into the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, they began enacting this agenda. And this is when I landed in Israel for my first extended reporting trip in May 2009, as they set out to fulfill their promise to the Israeli public, a promise that won them a sweeping landslide victory in high school mock elections in Israel, because it is the youth of Israel who are turning more right-wing than their elders. So I started to try to immerse myself in the key institutions of Israeli society, especially the Knesset, to interview the people in Lieberman's parties in his party who were introducing these laws. And I found myself in the office of Alex Miller, who was a 28-year-old Muscovite who had immigrated to Israel, whose Hebrew was not as good as that of Ahmed Tibi or Hanin Zouabi or any of the Palestinian legislators in the Knesset. And he was working on a series of laws to strip those legislators of their right to run for office and ultimately of their citizenship rights. And I mean, law after law was flowing through the Knesset each week. The acceptance to community law, which legalized the discrimination of communities of under 500 residents on the basis of race and religion, or the Jewish and/or democratic law, which would declare Israel's Jewish character to be superior to its democratic charter. It's been reauthorized. The law raising the electoral threshold to prevent Arab parties from holding office, because most of them had 2 or 3 seats, and this would require them to hold 4 seats. The anti-incitement law, which would mete out a jail sentence of 1 year to anyone who convinced another Israeli citizen to be disloyal, targeting the leadership of Palestinian-Israeli society. And Miller had introduced, I think, one of the most dangerous and revealing laws. And it was a law that he had introduced, clearly with consultation from his dear leader, Lieberman. This was not a guy who exhibited many signs of cerebral activity during our interview. And this law was the Nakba law. According to this law, as Miller introduced it, anyone who observed the Nakba, and I'm going to talk about what it is, in public as a tragedy, would face a 2-year jail sentence. Now, this was the key law targeting the Palestinian public inside Israel. Those who are supposed to enjoy equal rights. And when Netanyahu comes to the U.S., he says that Arabs in Israel are the freest in the world. So the Nakba was the expulsion or ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs between 1947 and 1948, which allowed the establishment of a Jewish state. A Jewish state could not have been established without the removal of these people, because it couldn't have consolidated a Jewish demographic majority when Jews were only 7% of the population, or slightly more, or controlled 7% of the land prior to the foundation of the State of Israel. So by the time David Ben-Gurion signed the Israeli Declaration of Independence in 1948, on May 15th, over 200 Palestinian villages had already been destroyed. And what followed was an organized campaign of expulsion. So every year on May 15th, Palestinians in Israel and across Palestine and throughout the world in the Palestinian diaspora will observe the foundation of the State of Israel as a tragedy, just as Native Americans do often on July 4th. Just as Frederick Douglass said he could never celebrate July 4th until slavery was abolished. Israelis on May 15th often go to a place called Canada Park. It's one of their favorite places to celebrate their Independence Day. And it's understandable. There are nice forests there, pine forests, which are sort of unusual to the region, bike trails, hiking trails, and nice picnicking grounds. And people come out and grill meats and watch the fireworks, and they sing nationalistic songs, just like Americans do on July 4th. But Palestinians observe those celebrations, I think, with a certain amount of resentment. And it's understandable if you consider the history of Canada Park, that in 1967, Canada Park was the site of 3 Palestinian villages, Yalu, Beit Nuba, and Imwas, which was Emmaus in the New Testament, where Jesus met with some of his disciples. And these villages had their residents removed from their homes. Their homes were detonated before their eyes when Israel captured the West Bank. And they were marched at gunpoint to Ramallah, never to return. And the Jewish National Fund, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that raises tens of millions of dollars in North America, built a forest on top of those villages to ensure that the residents couldn't return. If you walk into those forests, if you walk into Canada Park, you might trip over the rubble of the destroyed church in Imwas. You might trip over the homes in Yalu or Beit Nuba. The rocks are still there, buried beneath pine needles in a mountain of lies. And so Palestinians have sought to resurrect that history and the history of ethnic cleansing before in 47 and 48. And the Israeli government sees that and these observances as a threat to its very existence. It sees the Palestinian narrative as a threat to its existence. Limor Livnat, who was the former Minister of Culture and Sports in the last government, said that teaching the Nakba or the Palestinian narrative promotes disloyalty. And so she ordered the removal of textbooks from high school curriculum that contained a single reference to the Nakba, declaring that Palestinians considered it a tragedy. In fact, Likud functionaries were sent to bookstores across Israel to remove this book so that it would never see the light of day. But then Lieberman enters the Knesset to criminalize observance of the Nakba. The bill passed. It passed in diluted form. And now anyone who is connected to an NGO, especially the NGOs which defend the rights of Palestinians in Israel, and who is seen at a Nakba commemoration, can have their NGO financially penalized for their activities, and they can be financially, personally sanctioned as well. And this is consistent with a broader attack on human rights NGOs, including B'Tselem, including the New Israel Fund, by the entire Israeli right wing, to prevent them from receiving donations from abroad, to subject them to these kind of inquisitions in the Knesset, where they're accused of collaborating with European anti-Semites, while the right wing and their settlement enterprise, which is funded by real anti-Semites, like the Christian Zionist pastor John Hagee, are never subjected to such scrutiny. And what I find interesting about this law and why I chose to really talk about it so much is because it goes to, it highlights a key theme in my book, which is the idea of 1948 in Israeli life. And to some degree, the right wing understands 1948 correctly, which is that it is the source of Palestinian grievances, not 1967 when the Gaza Strip and West Bank were occupied. That is really seen as sort of an extension of 48. And another figure understands this correctly, from the liberal wing of the Zionist movement. His name is Ari Shavit. He's sort of been the toast of the liberal intelligentsia in the U.S. His book, which is called My Promised Land, has gotten a lot more promotion than my book. And I think in some cases it's sort of been deployed to drown out my book. And he approaches 1948 without any pretense that, he acknowledges completely that this was an act of ethnic cleansing. He acknowledges that it was a crime. He writes about it in detail, but then he declares that 1948 needed to happen in order for him to be born, and that he chooses to stand with the damned. In other words, he chooses to stand with the soldiers who ethnically cleansed the city of Lydda, which is now known as Lod. And he has been, welcomed on Charlie Rose to present this kind of apologia for ethnic cleansing. He's been welcomed on Terry Gross on shows that have denied me an appearance, and I find that incredibly interesting. But I have to agree with him that 48 is the source of the grievance, but I'm approaching it from a completely alternate perspective, which is that it should not have happened. I know that makes me an extremist. I showed up as number 9 on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's anti-Semite list, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel figures list, tied with Alice Walker. I was just behind European sports venues, those anti-Semitic stadiums. And it was because of this kind of analysis that 1948 should not have happened, that it should be reversed, that those who committed it should be prosecuted. But what I think really is threatening is that I approach it as an ongoing, continuous phenomenon, that every day for Palestinians is another 1948. It's because of my experience inside Israel-Palestine and what I witnessed on both sides of the Green Lines, that I didn't have to go very far to witness a village be wiped off the map by bulldozers from the Jewish National Fund or from the Israeli army. I didn't have to go very far In fact, when I stayed in Jerusalem, all I had to do was walk 10 minutes down the road to Sheikh Jarrah to watch people be literally thrown out of their home at night by Israeli police and have settlers walk in 15 minutes later and take over their house. It's just something you can watch every day. And so I really first came to understand this continuous process when I'm settled in Jaffa. Well, I didn't settle there. I rented a room with some Israeli leftists who were activists against the occupation, part of the group of probably less than 700 or less than 1,000 people who are actively engaged in fighting the occupation and apartheid. And I noticed that there were 500 standing eviction orders in the neighborhood. It's 5 minutes south of Tel Aviv. And I noticed that all those eviction orders applied to Palestinian citizens who lived in Jaffa. And that they told me they couldn't get building permits. They couldn't even get permits to renovate their kitchen. And they told me that the state owned 40% of their homes. I said, how is that possible? They told me that the state took their homes into a state-linked holding company in 1948 if they remained in the few homes that weren't bulldozed. And then the state would control what they could do with those homes. And anyone who renovated part of their house without a building permit would get an eviction order. People were being actively pushed out. I noticed that there were noise complaints being filed against the local church, the St. George's Church, which predated the foundation of the State of Israel, and noise complaints filed against the two mosques to silence the call of the muezzin. And the noise complaints were being filed by a new gated community called Andromeda Hills, which was an all-Jewish gated community planted in the center of Jaffa, the Palestinian ghetto of Tel Aviv. And I noticed that Benjamin Netanyahu had endorsed these noise complaints and said, we don't need to be more liberal than Europe. Clearly, there was a campaign to continue 48 by making life unbearable for those Palestinians who had managed to remain behind. And then my favorite fish restaurant, which was owned by Palestinian Christians, was firebombed by a group of vandals from the West Bank, from the settlements around the South Hebron Hills. And then they vandalized the local Muslim cemetery. And then I started noticing that there were marches through the center of Jaffa, down Yefet Street, of these settlers chanting Jaffa for Jews under the protection of the local police, the same border police which would set up checkpoints on the corner of where I lived, on Dr. Ehrlich Street, seeking infiltrators. In other words, Palestinians who had slipped in from the West Bank for work, and they would try to deport them. So there were checkpoints in my neighborhood inside the Green Line. And some of my Israeli activist friends would tell me that they increasingly couldn't notice any difference between what they saw in the West Bank and what they saw on this side of the Green Line. I was taken one night by a group of activists to Lod, to the site of massive ethnic cleansing in 1948, described in Ari Shavit's book, and also described in much more detail in my book. And I found myself in the middle of a neighborhood that looked like the Gaza Strip after Operation Cast Lead. I saw men standing around open flames trying to keep themselves warm, around open fires. I saw children sleeping in tents in the middle of rubble, trying to do their homework during rainy season. An entire neighborhood had been destroyed because its residents had been denied building permits, and they sought to build their homes according to their family's natural growth, and they had been now turned into a refugee camp. They placed a little sign over their destroyed neighborhood that said, "Welcome to the Abu Aid refugee camp." And they told me that the days of 48 have come again. It was the same thing that the people in Al-Araqib, an unrecognized Bedouin village over 100 kilometers south of Lod, told me. The exact same phrase they told me. The days of 1948 have come again. And once again, I was taken to this village by some very brave Israeli Jewish activists in the middle of the night. We arrived there. It's the middle of the desert. Bedouins put out mattresses for us. They give us some coffee. We doze off for a few hours, and we're awakened by the sound of bulldozers rumbling into the village and a phalanx of masked riot cops who begin tossing people out of their homes, tossing activists aside like empty crates, and the bulldozers set in to wipe the village off the face of the map, to literally wipe it off the face of the map in front of my eyes. Again, this is inside the green line. These Bedouins are citizens of the state of Israel, and they are being ethnically cleansed before our eyes because they have been identified by the state of Israel and its government as a demographic threat, as a contaminant to the ethnic purity of the Jewish state. There are currently 80,000 Bedouins living in unrecognized villages in the Negev desert. Their villages can't be recognized because they are not Jewish. And that means that they can't hook up to the state electricity supply, even though they live under, in most cases, under electrical wires. They can't have public health clinics in their villages. They can't have public schools in their villages. And all construction, all homes, all mosques, all facilities are declared illegal construction, which can be bulldozed at any time. And so I witnessed this in Al-Araqib. This was the third time it had been bulldozed. It has been bulldozed 54 times since I witnessed that bulldozing. And the moment that these riot police and bulldozers left the village, dragging the village water tank away with them to make it uninhabitable, these Israeli Jewish activists and the Bedouins began immediately to rebuild. And so they've built again, and each time it's destroyed again, until the state recently sued the residents of the village for the demolition costs, to force them to pay for the demolition of their own homes. There is a logic behind this. There is a cold calculus behind it all, which is to move the residents of these villages, all unrecognized Bedouin villages, to what amount to Indian reservations, like the...
More of his talk on our program next week. I just want to emphasize what's being done is done to Israeli citizens, but a special subgroup who are treated as enemies or as subhumans because they happen to be Palestinians. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.
When the world has gone crazy and it's all becoming clear, when they're gunning down our comrades and it seems the end is near, as they're loading up the launchers for the tear gas grenades, we can take off our bandanas and kiss behind the barricades. When it's madness all around and you can see this at a glance, we will sing and we